What's up? My name is John O, and today, boys and girls, I'm going to show you how to EQ a bass guitar in just 30 seconds. Oh, and if you haven't, be sure to watch my introduction to EQ video first before you watch this one. Here's a recording of a bass guitar. I'm going to try a quick 30-second EQ to get it sounding more polished and mix ready. Not bad, right? So let's dive into the how. I'm going to start by explaining what I look for when I'm EQing my bass and show you where to find it in your EQ. Then I'll explain how I vary my EQ depending on the type of bass I get or the type of song I'm mixing. This way you know exactly how to apply this stuff when you're mixing. I'm also going to limit myself to just 4 EQ points because that's usually the limitation of most live consoles or basic EQs, and I want to show you that shouldn't stop you from getting a really great sounding EQ. Lastly, I'll start from scratch and EQ 2 totally different bass guitars again in just 30 seconds. Cool, let's begin. The first thing I do is switch on a high pass filter on my bass at roughly 50 Hz because the subby low end on a bass guitar is really subject to how loud or soft the bassist is playing, where they're fretting their notes, how they're playing with their right hand, etc. And I really don't want that much unpredictability in my subs. When most sound engineers notice this on my bass EQ, they immediately think, wow, this monkey clearly has no clue what he's doing. I know it sounds really counterintuitive because why would you apply a low cut on a bass, right? But I'll show you why this actually works really well. Firstly, I'll switch my high pass filter on and off. It sounds like we've tightened up the bass and made it sound nice and solid. Secondly, you might recall from last week's video on kick EQ that this low cut in my bass is exactly where I boost the low end of my kick. This is crucial because this ensures the kick and the bass are never fighting for space in the frequency spectrum. The only exception is when I'm dealing with synth bass, then there are usually sub-bass frequencies being generated as well, and this low end tends to be much more controlled. So instead of a high pass filter, I'll have a cut at about 40 to 50 Hz to ensure that the kick always has ample space. Next, I use EQ 0.1 at roughly 100 Hz to boost the low end of the bass if necessary. Notice I've got a nice wide Q here, and this is important. We never use narrow Qs on bass because narrow Qs cause very noticeable buildup of resonance in bass instruments. What that would sound like is certain notes the bassist plays will seemingly disappear, while other notes will suddenly jump out and sound really jarring. On some basses, you can feel a dip in the low end when you apply a high pass filter, and this boost helps to make up for it so the listener still perceives the bass as nice and big. Moving on, next I use EQ 0.2 to boost at roughly 2 to 300 Hz to highlight the notes the bassist is playing. The frequencies below this tend to be low end you feel rather than bass notes you hear, and this is important particularly when I'm EQing a bass for IEMs because I want the vocalist to be able to easily identify the notes the bassist is playing so that they can remain on pitch. I also use this boost to help glue my bass with the rest of the instrumentation in the mix, so it never feels like the bass is just low end that's separate from everything else. You might recall that I also applied this exact same principle on my kick when I boost the highs at about 4 to 5K. Next, I use EQ 0.3 to boost at roughly 4 to 500 Hz with a wide Q to highlight the natural growl of the bass. These frequencies actually sound like a drive on the bass, and I'll explain later how I make use of this in my mix. Lastly, I have my EQ 0.4 still left over to use as my problem-solving EQ if there are any issues with the bass. For example, if the bassist is playing with a pick and playing too aggressively, then there tends to be an excessive buildup of highs and high mids that I can tame with EQ 0.4. Make sense? Now I'm going to explain the variables to you. Obviously, different basses have different tones, and sometimes you might not have the luxury of changing the tone coming from a bass guitar or a bass amp, or maybe you're dealing with an uncooperative bassist who refuses to change their tone. I've found that bass guitars generally fall into three broad broad categories. 1. The source just sounds awesome as is. Fun times. 2. Bass guitars that sound too boomy or muddy. And 3. Bass guitars that sound thin and have way too much mids in their tone. First, I'll show you how I deal with the boomy basses. I use my high-pass filter to tame those boomy lows, moving my high-pass filter up to the right till I'm satisfied. Initially, this might leave the bass sounding really small in comparison to the original signal, so I boost EQ point 1 to make the bass sound big and thick again. Next, I use EQ point 2 to make the notes of the bass more audible and glue the bass together with the rest of the mix. EQ point 3 is the fun bit. Suppose I'm dealing with a relatively empty mix. For example, a band with mainly one guitar driving the music with funk strumming. This kind of strumming tends to produce mainly high mid information, so there's a hole left behind in the low mids of the mix. I boost EQ point 3 to help the bass fill up more space in the low mids, and I explain this in more detail in my video on bass frequencies to evoke a feeling, so do check that out if you haven't. These boosts in EQ point 2 and 3 help the bass to fill up more low mids in the mix. In a church setting, sometimes I have a situation where both the guitarist and keyboardist get excited to play the nice high lead line in the instrumental part of a worship song. This tends to cause a sudden hole in the low mids of the mix, and I fill up this space by boosting the low mids in the bass using EQ point 3. It almost sounds like I switched on a drive pedal on my bass, right? By doing this, the mix keeps sounding full. On the other hand, if I'm mixing a band with two electric guitarists where one's mainly covering rhythms and the other one's playing lead lines, then I might dip at EQ point 3 instead, because there's already going to be lots of low mid drive information in the mix. Now what if I'm dealing with a bassist with way too much mids in their tone? This is pretty common in rock or punk rock music or bassists who have come from a background of playing guitars. First, I use EQ point 1 to beef up their tone. Next, I'll use EQ point 2 and 3 to tame the already excessive mids so that the bass leaves space for more MIDI instruments like keys and guitars. Make sense? To prove how easy it is to apply these principles on any type of bass guitar, I'm going to start from scratch and EQ two totally different bass guitars again in just 30 seconds. Not bad, right? And here's the last one. I hope that's given you guys all you need to know for bass EQs. Here's a cheat sheet to help you remember everything we've covered today. You can pause the video and save a screenshot of this for future reference. For live sound engineers, remember that the soundcheck is when I'm looking to set my cues and frequencies so that during the set, the only thing I ever need to adjust is my gain for any one of these EQ points. Next week, we're going to be diving back into drum EQ, so stay tuned for that. I'm John O. Don't forget to subscribe for more.